The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Gideon Hartwell's personal assistant was already in tears by the time she reached the second sentence. "The Nakamura deal," she said, her voice cracking. "Yuki collapsed. They took him to St. Michael's 20 minutes ago. Cardiac event. He's stable, but he's not. He won't be there tomorrow. He can't be there tomorrow." Gideon said nothing for a long moment. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse suite at the Fairmont Royal York, looking down at the winter grid of Toronto laid out below him, the orange pulse of King Street, the black sheet of the harbor beyond. 22 floors up, the city looked orderly, manageable, like something he controlled. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that Yuki Tanaka had been his lead interpreter for 9 years, and that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., 3 delegations, Japanese, German, and Quebecois, were flying into a boardroom on Bay Street expecting Hartwell Capital to broker the largest private infrastructure deal in Canadian history. $3 billion. 4 parties, 2 of whom spoke no English worth mentioning. "Call the agency," he said. "I did. Both agencies. It's 11:50 at night, Mr. Hartwell. The earliest anyone can confirm is Thursday." He ended the call. He stood there for another full minute, his hand still on the phone, and then he did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the contact saved under a number he'd never deleted, scrolled past it 3 times before stopping, and then set the phone face down on the windowsill, because he wasn't going to call that one either. His assistant called back 4 minutes later. This is going to sound strange. "Tell me, my cousin works in hospitality. She says there's a woman. She's done corporate interpretation before, apparently." "In formal settings," she says, "which I know isn't. How many languages?" A pause. She said Japanese, German, French, and Mandarin. And English, obviously. Gideon turned away from the window. Get her here by 8. Her name was Ruthann Polly, and she arrived at 8:06 carrying a canvas tote bag from a Kensington Market bookshop and a coffee cup from the Tim Hortons on Queen that still had a roll-up-the-rim sticker on the side. She was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, soft around the middle in the way that good wool coats tried to hide, and usually couldn't, with dark hair pinned up in something that wasn't quite a bun and wasn't quite anything else. And she walked into the lobby of Hartwell Capital like she was walking into a public library, curious, unhurried, completely unbothered by the fact that every person she passed was wearing something that cost more than her rent. The assistant, a young man named Marcus who looked like he hadn't slept, met her at the elevator bank. "Mrs. Polly, thank you for coming on such short notice. Ruthann's fine." She glanced at the building directory as they passed it. "Which floor?" 14. "The Yamamoto delegation is already here. The Brandt group lands at Pearson Inn." He checked his watch. 40 minutes. "The Beaumont Legoux team is coming from Montreal. They'll be the last to arrive, probably 9:15. Ruthann nodded, unhooking her tote from her shoulder and pulling out a small spiral notebook. "Anyone I should know about before I go in? Personalities, sensitivities, anything like that?" Marcus blinked. Sorry, what? Anyone who's going to be difficult, or who I should be careful with. Honorifics matter in certain contexts. I'd rather know ahead of time than that's. I honestly don't know. Mr. Hartwell usually handles that." She looked at him. "Okay, what about Mr. Hartwell?" Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it. He's very direct." "Good," she said, and stepped into the elevator. Gideon Hartwell had been described in the Financial Post as relentlessly precise, in Report on Business as the kind of man who makes other men feel imprecise, and once memorably in a profile he'd never forgiven, as handsome the way a very expensive knife is handsome. You're aware of it. But mostly what you're aware of is the edge. He was 44 years old, lean in the way that came from discipline rather than luck, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the sort of controlled stillness that powerful men developed when they'd spent enough years being watched. He was standing at the head of the boardroom table when Ruthann walked in, and he looked at her the way she'd expected him to look at her. The quick, practiced scan that registered her weight, her coat, her Tim Hortons cup, and her age, in roughly that order, and reached a conclusion before she'd taken 3 steps. She'd been looked at like that before. She'd stopped minding it around 26. Mrs. Polly. He didn't cross the room, didn't extend his hand. Ruthann. She set her tote on the credenza along the wall and took out her notebook and 2 pens, 1 black, 1 red. The Yamamoto group is already here. In the anteroom. Who's the lead? Yamamoto Kenji. He's the one who actually needs to hear everything clearly. The other 2 are regional directors. They're mostly observational. Kenji's been dealing with North American partners for 20 years, but he prefers interpretation. It's a formality that matters to him. She wrote that down. And the Brandt Group? Ingrid Brandt. She's the one who built the firm. She still speaks the way her grandmother spoke. Bavarian German, not standard. Your predecessor used to adjust for it automatically. Ruthann looked up. I'll adjust. Something moved through Gideon's expression. Not quite skepticism, not quite anything she could name. He nodded once, very slightly, like a judge acknowledging a point not yet proven. The Beaumont-Legault contingent comes from Chicoutimi, he continued. Their French is Saganayan, she said. I know. This time he looked at her properly. Not the scan, actually looked. You've worked up there? I went to school in Jonquière, 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. My assistant said you do corporate work, among other things. What other things? She clicked her pen once. I've done medical interpretation at Mount Sinai, court interpretation for legal aid. I spent 8 months in Osaka teaching conversational English to executives. I did a year at the Goethe Institute in München. That's where the Bavarian German comes in. And I have a standing contract with a translation firm on Bloor that handles Japanese business correspondence. She paused. I also waitress at a place on Dundas on Fridays, but I don't think that's relevant. The silence in the room was particular. She'd learned to read silences. There were the ones that meant I don't believe you, and the ones that meant I'm recalculating, and occasionally the ones that meant something else entirely. This one was the second kind. The Yamamoto Group, he said finally. I'll introduce you as a consultant. Fine, don't editorialize, don't add. Interpret what's said exactly as it's said. I know what interpreting means, Mr. Hartwell. Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement that one existed, somewhere. All right, Ruthann, he said. Let's go. Yamamoto Kenji was 63 years old, small and extremely neat, with the measured courtesy of a man who had spent his career reading rooms. He greeted Gideon with appropriate formality, glanced at Ruthann with the same calibrated assessment she'd received from Gideon 20 minutes earlier, and then, because he was more practiced at concealing his conclusions, shifted his face into polite neutrality and said nothing. Ruthann bowed at the correct degree. Kenji blinked. She said, in Japanese that was clean and formal without being stiff, that it was an honor to meet him, and that she hoped the morning would be fruitful for everyone present. She used the correct register. She used his title properly. She referred to the deal using the phrasing she'd learned was preferred in Tokyo corporate circles, the one that implied partnership rather than transaction. The change in the room was small but seismic. Kenji's posture shifted, barely perceptibly, towards something warmer. One of his regional directors exchanged a glance with the other. Gideon, standing 2 feet to her left, noticed. She could tell because his own posture shifted, away from the braced readiness he'd been holding since she walked in, toward something fractionally less, like a man preparing for failure. When the Brandt delegation arrived, Ingrid herself, square-jawed and energetic, with 2 lawyers and an engineer trailing behind her, the introductions moved quickly. Ingrid spoke first to Gideon in accented English, the English of someone who'd learned it at 40 and didn't care if you noticed, and then she turned to the table and said something to her team in rapid Bavarian German that her lawyers immediately tried to smooth over. Ruthann said, calmly and in kind in the same dialect, "The east-facing boardrooms are always like this. The light bothers everyone at first." Ingrid Brandt stopped moving. She looked at Ruthann, fully looked, for the first time, and then she laughed. A real one, the kind that rearranges a person's face entirely. "Wer bist du?" she asked. "Who are you?" "The interpreter," Ruthann said, still in German. "I can ask someone to—" No. Ingrid was still smiling. She switched to English for the table's benefit. "I like the light. I was only complaining." She glanced at Gideon with an expression that was equal parts respect and amusement. "You found a good one?" Gideon said. "I did," and he said it with a smoothness that suggested he had been confident of this all along, which Ruthann found both impressive and deeply annoying. The Beaumont-Legault team arrived at 9:20. Their lead was a man named Réjean Beaumont, third generation, who wore a plaid shirt under his blazer and looked slightly suspicious of everyone in the room on general principle, which Ruthann recognized as a specifically Saguenayan trait and found quietly endearing. He spoke to his associate in the rapid, swallowed French of the Saguenay, the kind where consonants went missing and vowels did unusual things, and the associate apparently said something about the size of the room. Ruthann said, in the same French, that the room was slightly ridiculous, but the coffee was genuinely good, and that she'd had worse mornings in smaller spaces. Réjean's head came up. "T'es du coin? Are you from around there?" "Jonquière," she said. "Trozan." He nodded slowly, reassessing her with the particular care of someone from a small place who'd learned not to trust city people on instinct. Then he nodded again, differently, a settling-in nod, a "we're fine" nod. "Okay," he said, and then, in English for the room, "Okay, let's talk." What happened over the next 3 hours was the kind of thing Gideon Hartwell had spent his career engineering and rarely actually witnessed at such close range. The deal was complicated. It involved fiber optic infrastructure rights, a cross-border environmental covenant that the German firm had specific requirements around, and a series of provincial approvals that the Beaumont-Legault team had concerns about, that they'd been communicating imprecisely for 6 months, and that Ruthann, over the course of 40 minutes, helped them articulate in a way that finally made the Japanese delegation understand what the actual sticking point was. It wasn't that she was simply converting words. She was converting intent. She was reading what each party was trying to say underneath what they were actually saying, and she was finding the version of it that landed correctly on the other side. When Yamamoto Kenji made a comment that his team laughed at and Ingrid's lawyers looked blank, Ruthann translated the words and then, without editorializing, technically, though she was absolutely editorializing, added the cultural context that made the laughter make sense. Gideon, seated at the head of the table, watched this. He was not a man who missed things. He had built his career on not missing things. And what he was watching, across a 14-person boardroom table, was someone doing something that he couldn't do, that most people couldn't do, with a kind of quiet competency that asked for no acknowledgement and expected none. At 11:15, there was a break. The delegations moved to the adjoining lounge. Marcus appeared with more coffee. Ruthann sat down for the first time all morning, opened her notebook to a clean page, and wrote 3 words in German and circled them. Gideon sat down across from her. "The covenant language," he said, "Brandt's concern. She's worried it creates a precedent. She doesn't want her firm's environmental standards to become a negotiating flaw that future partners use against them." Ruthann kept her eyes on the notebook. She hasn't said it that directly yet, but that's what it is. If you can get your lawyers to propose a carve-out in Section 4 that applies only to this project and explicitly excludes future, I'll have it drafted in 20 minutes. She nodded, a pause. "You went to Jonquière," he said. "Collège d'Alma, actually. Then Jonquière for 2 years." She looked up. "Why?" "I'm trying to understand how someone who speaks 4 languages is available on 11 hours' notice on a Wednesday." There was something in the question that wasn't unkind exactly, but was very direct in the way that Marcus had warned her about. She met it the same way she met most things, straight on, without apology. "5, she said. "Sorry. 5 languages. You didn't ask about Mandarin." She capped her pen. And I'm available because I'm freelance. I don't have a firm. I don't have a corner office. I have a phone that rings when someone needs what I can do, and I answer it." He studied her for a long moment. She let him. "That seems," he said carefully, "like an inefficient use of your abilities. It seems that way to a lot of people. And I'm sitting in your boardroom on a Wednesday morning saving a $3 billion deal, so." She picked up her coffee. "I think I'm fine." The afternoon session was harder. Réjean Beaumont had concerns about timeline that his team kept expressing in the wrong register, too confrontational, which was landing wrong on the Japanese side, where confrontation in negotiation was understood differently. 3 times the temperature in the room ticked up towards something that could have calcified into a genuine impasse. 3 times Ruthann found the angle. The second time, she spoke to Yamamoto Kenji's senior director. Quietly, in Japanese, in the brief window when Gideon and Ingrid were reviewing the revised covenant language, and said something that made the director nod slowly, and then murmur to Kenji, and Kenji's expression changed from careful to engaged. Gideon, across the room, caught the shift but not the cause. He looked at Ruthann. She had already looked away. The third time she spoke to Réjean directly, in French, low and fast. "Il ne pense pas que t'es agressif. Il pense que t'es pressé. Présente ça comme une priorité, pas une urgence." They don't think you're aggressive. They think you're in a hurry. Frame it as a priority, not an emergency. Réjean paused, then he nodded. Then he spoke to the table in English, rephrased, and the temperature dropped 6 degrees. Gideon did not look at Ruthann this time. He looked at Réjean, but the set of his jaw changed, the fractional unclenching of someone whose worst-case scenario has just quietly exited the room. At 4:07 p.m., Yamamoto Kenji put his pen down. The sound was small. In that room at that moment, it was enormous. He said something in Japanese, not to Gideon, not to the room, but to Ruthann, who was seated beside the window where she'd moved after lunch, because the afternoon light was better there, and she'd long since stopped sitting where she was told. She listened. She didn't write anything in the notebook. Then she turned to the table. "Mr. Yamamoto would like to say that this has been the most productive conversation he's had with a North American partner in 11 years. He says the words are not the usual barrier. He says," she paused just briefly, "that it is usually the willingness to hear what is actually being said. He feels that today everyone was heard." The room was very quiet. Ingrid Brandt, who was not a sentimental woman, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Réjean Beaumont cleared his throat. 2 of the lawyers started making notes that they didn't need to make. Gideon looked at Ruthann. She was looking at Yamamoto Kenji, her expression open and calm, and she said something back to him in Japanese. Something short. Something that made him incline his head in a way that was more than courtesy. Gideon had spent years at tables like this one. He knew what real agreement looked like versus performed agreement, and what he was looking at across the room was the real thing. He knew who had made it possible. The delegations left in stages. Ingrid Brandt shook Ruthann's hand at the elevator and said, in German, "You should come to Munich," and Ruthann said in German, "I've been," and Ingrid laughed again, that real laugh, and said, "Then you know why I'm inviting you back." Yamamoto Kenji bowed. He said something to her as he left that she translated for no one, because it was meant for her. Réjean Beaumont was last. He stopped beside her on the way out, hands in his pockets, looking slightly more at ease than he'd looked all day. "'Tes bon," he said. "You're good." "Je sais," she said. "I know," he snorted, nodded, left. The boardroom was empty except for Gideon and Ruthann and the wreckage of a day's work. The papers, the water glasses, the 2 notepads Gideon had gone through in the afternoon session. Marcus had disappeared somewhere. The cleaning crew hadn't come yet. The city outside the windows was going orange and grey with the early winter dark. Ruthann was repacking her tote. Notebook, pens, the German dictionary she'd pulled out once and not needed. "Ruthann," she looked up. Gideon was standing at the end of the table, jacket off, looking slightly less like a knife and slightly more like a person. He had the revised covenant language in his hand. The document his lawyers had drafted at 11:30, and that had, ultimately, been the pivot point of the afternoon. "The retainer my firm offers for ongoing interpretation work," he said. "I want to offer it to you." She stood up straight. "You have a firm you work with." "I did. Yuki handled everything in-house for 9 years, and before him there were 2 others who were each very good and very specialized." "You are." He stopped. "You're something different." "That's a diplomatic way to put it. I'm not being diplomatic. I'm being accurate." He set down the document. "You're not just translating words. You know what I mean when I say that." She did know. She'd always known. It was what she'd spent the better part of a decade trying to explain to people who kept asking why she hadn't done more with her abilities, as though what she was doing wasn't already something. "The retainer," she said. "What does it look like?" He named a number. She kept her face completely neutral, which required some effort because the number was significant. "And what would it involve?" "Being available, primarily for deals at this level, but also, there's a mediation in February involving a Korean tech acquisition and a francophone holding company that has been going sideways for 8 months. There's a Japanese-Canadian joint venture in the resource sector that's been stalled over an interpretation dispute that I suspect is actually a cultural misread. And there are smaller things, ongoing things." She looked at him. "I'm freelance," she said. "I have other clients. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to put Hartwell Capital at the top of the list when the phone rings." He paused. "I'm also asking because you're better than anyone I've worked with, and I've worked with very good people." The room was quiet. Somewhere below them, 40 floors down, the city moved on without them. She thought about the Kensington Market tote, the Tim Hortons cup, the way he had looked at her when she walked off the elevator this morning, that quick survey, that rapid conclusion. She thought about Ingrid Brandt's laugh and the way Yamamoto Kenji had bowed, and Rajan Beaumont's 2-word verdict in the hallway. She thought about what it meant to be good at something and spend years doing it in rooms where no one in charge thought to ask. "I have one condition," she said. He waited. "When I tell you something about how a conversation is going, when I tell you there's a cultural friction point, or that a phrasing is landing wrong, or that you need to adjust, you listen. You don't override me because you think you understand the room better. You brought me here to understand the room. Let me do that." Something in his expression, the careful, controlled thing he kept his face doing, shifted. "That's not a condition," he said. "That's a professional expectation. A lot of people don't know the difference. I know the difference." She studied him. He held it, didn't shift, didn't perform, just looked back at her with the same level attention she was giving him. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "Yes." She picked up her tote, emailed the contract to the address Marcus has. "I'll have my people look it over." "You have people?" "I have a cousin who went to Osgood." She swung the tote onto her shoulder. "She handles my contracts." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he put it back. "The Korean acquisition," he said as she reached the door. "February 3rd. I'll need background materials at least 2 weeks out. You'll have them." She nodded. Pushed the door open. "Ruthann." She stopped. He was still standing at the end of the table in the last of the grey winter light. And he looked, for just a moment, like a man who had spent 9 years working with someone irreplaceable and was only now understanding what that had been worth. Because he'd just found out what it looked like to find it again. "Thank you," he said. I know what today was." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "Send the contract." She let the door close behind her. In the elevator going down, she looked at her reflection in the brushed steel doors, her coat, her hair, half escaped from whatever it had been that morning. The tote bag from the bookshop on Augusta. She looked exactly like herself. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the marble and the rush of the 5 o'clock Bay Street crowd. Everyone going somewhere, everyone moving, the city doing what it always did in the last hour of a working day. That collective exhale, that release of held breath. She stepped out into it. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus." "Mr. Hartwell asked me to tell you the contract will be sent tonight. Also, and I'm just conveying this, he'd like to know if you're available the week of January 19th. There's a preliminary meeting for the Korean acquisition he'd like you to sit in on. She typed back, "Send the schedule." She put the phone in her pocket and walked out through the revolving doors into the cold Toronto air, and thought about the number he'd said, and thought about February 3rd, and thought about what it felt like to walk into a room and be underestimated and walk out of it, having changed something that $3 billion and 6 months of lawyers couldn't move. It felt, as it always had, like exactly enough.